Hello and welcome to amarman.com YouTube channel. And in this video, we will discuss about a very important concept related to object-oriented ABAP, that is instance methods, static methods, and functional methods. The objective of this video is to understand how to create an instance method, how to create a static method, how to create a functional method, and then how to call these methods in our program. We will also see method signature. But before we actually start with the video, let me ask you a question. Pause the video and give an answer to the question in the comment section that what will be the output of this code. I will give a like to the correct answer of this. Now let's switch back to today's video of working with instance methods, static methods, and functional methods in object-oriented ABAP local class. So the very first thing that we would like to discuss here is the signature of a object-oriented ABAP method. That is, what is the syntax and what is the signature of the method. So if you look at this piece of code example that we have given here, basically all the methods will be defined using the methods keyword, right? Followed by the method name. And then a method can have importing parameters, exporting parameters, changing parameters, and returning parameters, right? And you can have any number of importing, exporting, or changing parameters. There is no restriction. Plus, when you define the parameters, you have to type them with either a existing data type, or you can use a structure to pass work areas or to define the importing parameter as a work area, or even you can use a table type when you would like to pass a data of internal table format. So the parameters, all these different types of parameters is supported. Then you can also define exceptions or raising to handle exceptions and raising to handle class-based exception. Now remember that it's a good practice to define either of the two. You should not use both in the same method definition. So either you can use exceptions or you can use raising. Next point that we can understand here is that by default, all these parameters are mandatory. So if you are defining these parameters, then it is mandatory to pass these parameters, right? Especially when we talk about the importing parameter. So by default, you have to pass all the importing parameters, and by default, all of the parameters of a method are mandatory. But then if you want to make the parameter as optional, then you can use addition, optional, or default to make the parameter as optional parameter. Another thing that we can understand is that by default, all the parameters are passed by reference. Fine. And all the parameters are by default passed by reference. But if you want to make it pass by value, then you would like to have the addition value in your parameter. So it will be something like this. All right. So these are some basic or important points related to object-oriented ABAP method definition that you should know. That is the type of parameters that it supports, that is importing, exporting, changing, and returning, and the type of exceptional handling it supports. Now let's discuss the type of methods that we have in object-oriented ABAP. We have instance method and we have static method. So these are the two type of methods that you can define in your object-oriented ABAP class. Instance methods are instance specific, that is, they belong to a particular instance or object. But static method is not instance specific. They can be called by even the class itself. So that is the key difference between the instance methods, which is basically instance specific, whereas static methods, which are they are not instance specific and can be called by the class name itself. Now here I have just given a syntax of how do you call a method. You use the call method statement to call a method. Now this call method is optional, by the way, and you can avoid it. It's not mandatory to use the call method, but basically you use the name of the object reference followed by the arrow operator and followed by the method name. So this is how you call an instance method, and you can omit this call method. This is basically a optional keyword. If you want to use it, you can use it, else you can omit it. Then how do you call the static method? Basically, we call the static method by using the class name followed by the implies operator or equal to and greater than sign and followed by the static method name. So this is how we call the static method. Next, let us see an example of object-oriented ABAP in which we will see the definition of all these different types of methods. That is your instance method, static method, functional methods, and how do you call these methods either through an object or through a class name. So we will understand all these concepts in detail with the help of an example. So let us look at this example that I have created here. Very first thing, it's a local class. We have created a local class. We have created a local class with the name LCL student. So this is the class definition. It starts all the way here and the class definition ends all the way here to line number 27. So this is the class definition part. Now, in this class definition part, we have primarily two sections we have created. One is the public section and we have the private section. So from your earlier understanding, you might be aware that public section components under the public section can be accessed from outside the class, whereas the private section components can only be accessed from within the class. So we have defined these two sections. Now inside the public section, I have created a static attribute. How do you create a static attribute? You use the keyword class data to create a static attribute followed by the name of the attribute, and you can define it with a type. So in this particular case, I have defined a static attribute maximum number of students, which is of type integer, and we have given a default value to it as value 30, and this is a read-only attribute. Now, what is the concept of read-only attribute? Is that a read-only attribute can only be defined under the public section. So this is one important point. And second point is that the read-only attribute can be called from outside the class. That is, we can read the value of this read-only attribute, but we cannot change its value. So these are the two important points you should know, that a read-only attribute can only be defined in the public section. And second thing is, you cannot change the value of a read-only attribute from outside the class. So it is read-only. After defining this static attribute, that is maximum number of students, we have defined two methods here. So one method is set attribute and another one is get attribute. Basically, you can define or you can term it as setter and getter methods, with the help of which we will be creating students in our program. So this set attribute or set attribute method has two importing parameters, that is IVID and IVName, which is of type integer and type character. Now, another point that you can notice here is that when you are defining a parameter of type C, you actually don't need to provide length over here. So you don't need to write length, right? So you only define the parameter and its type. So you don't actually have to specify the length. Okay, and then another method I have defined here called as get attribute. It doesn't have any parameter. Now this method is defined using the keyword methods. So it is an instance method. Both these two methods, get attribute and set attribute, they are instance methods. After this, I have defined another method called as class methods. defined using the keyword class method. Now this is a static method, and it doesn't have any parameter, and the name of the method is display number of students. And then I have also defined another static method called as get seats vacant, which has a returning parameter which is of type integer. Okay. Now, one point that you can understand here is that when you are having a returning parameter, first thing is that you can have only one returning parameter. So you cannot have more than one, or you should not have more than one returning parameter. You should always have just one returning parameter. A method that has a returning parameter, those type of methods are known as functional methods. So this is known as a functional method. Functional method will have one returning parameter, and they can have any number of importing parameters, but they cannot have exporting and changing parameters. So a functional method will have only importing parameters and one returning parameter. So this functional method I have defined as a static method. So this was my public section definition. And then let us talk about what we have defined inside the private section. So under the private section, I have used data to define the instance attributes. So I have two attributes, MB ID and MB name. Then I have used class data to define a static attribute, number of students, global value, number of students, and then also I have defined a constant. So which is of type C, len2, and value of this constant is CS. So basically the idea here was that we are trying to create students for computer science department. So I would like to make it as a constant. But the whole point is that constants cannot be changed. So if you try to change the value of constant anywhere in your program, you will get error. So you cannot change the value of the constant. So it was just to demonstrate the concept of constant. Okay, so once you have understood the definition part, let us look at the implementation part. So in total, we have four methods defined in our program. We have two instance methods. So this is one instance method, and this is the second instance method, that is get attributes and set attributes. And we have two static methods. So display number of students and get seats vacant. Now these two are static methods, and this one especially is a functional method, as we had just now seen. It's a functional method. Then when you are trying to do the implementation of a class, right? So in the implementation part, the only thing that you do is you implement all the methods that you have defined in your class definition. Implementation will only hold implementation of the methods, and it will not hold anything else. Again, another point you should remember is that implementation is not mandatory. So if you don't have any method defined in your class, you don't need the implementation of the class. Okay, another point that is important to note down over here is that there is no difference in the keyword implementation of instance method or a static method. So both of them is implemented using the same keyword, that is method and method. So there is no difference between the two. Okay, so these are some key points, and now let us try to understand what we have defined here. So in the set attribute, basically it is very simple. We are trying to set the private attributes MB ID and MB name with what we are receiving in the method, in the parameters, with the parameters of the method. And then we are also manipulating or increasing the value of the static attribute. So remember, this is the static attribute. So this is your static attribute. These two are your instance attributes. Fine. And we are trying to increase the value of static attribute with 1. All right. So what this will do is basically whenever we create an object, we will call this method set attribute, all right, and it will increase the value of number of students with 1. Fine. And as we start creating more and more students, the value of this GV number of students will hold the number of students that we have created. Okay, so that is set attribute. Get attribute is the opposite of it, that when we would like to display the students that we have created, then we will use the get attribute. All right. Now remember that all these three attributes, whether it is instance or static, they are actually private attributes. And the concept of private attribute is that you cannot access the private attributes directly from outside the class. You can only access the private components from within the class. Hence, we will need the methods to access these attributes. Okay, coming down here, display number of students. This is basically a static method. All right. And here what we are doing, we are just displaying the value of this static attribute, GV number of students. So this is our static attribute. So one point that we can add in here is that a static method can only access static attributes. So they cannot access the instance attributes. With a static method, you can only access static attributes. Fine. And then finally, we have this last one, that is get seats vacant. So as you must have seen earlier in the definition part of this code, we have a static attribute there called as maximum number of students, whose value is fixed to 30, right? So now, so this is the maximum number of students that is possible in this class. And what will happen is that when we are defining this functional method, then what we are doing here, we are just subtracting maximum number of students minus the global value number of students. All right. So we will get how many seats are vacant. So that is the whole idea. And this is passed to RV vacant, right? So RV vacant is our returning parameter. So when you are using the functional method, basically you will have to fill the value of this returning parameter, or whatever returning parameter you have defined, you will have to fill its value. Okay, so this was basically the implementation part. And then we would like to understand the further piece of the code. So in the very beginning, I have done the declaration part. So here I have declared a reference variable, that is geo underscore student, which is basically a reference variable type ref2 local class student. And I have created another reference variable which can hold objects. So it is basically, you can say, kind of an internal table inside which you can store objects, right? So we can store objects. So this is another collection of reference variables. So this we have defined using type table of ref2. So this is a reference variable, declaration of a reference variable, and this is collection of reference variables or collection of instances, which will be like an internal table that will hold object. So it is defined using type table of ref2. And finally, I have created here one more variable called as gv global variable seats vacant, which is of type integer. Then we write the start of selection, and the very first thing that I'm doing here is that I'm displaying the total seats in the class. So what I'm doing here, I'm using the class name, and this is my static attribute. So the point to notice here is that when you are trying to access a static attribute, you don't actually need the object of the class. by using the class name itself, you can call the static attribute. Okay, next, I'm using the class name to call the static method display number of students. So at this moment, we haven't created any students, so we will get the value 0 as our output. So this method display number of students will be called, and if you go here, display number of students. So number of students in CS department, GB number of students. So at this moment, the value of GB number of students is 0. So we will see just 0 as the output. Okay, then I'm creating my object. So I'm using create object with the data reference, and with the object, I'm calling the instance method set attributes. So remember that you can always call the instance method by using the object reference. You cannot call the instance method directly by the class name. Okay, and we are passing the parameters. So once this code executes, basically it will jump all the way to this set attribute method, wherein it will fill the data of these two instance attributes, plus it will increment the value of this static attribute by 1. Okay, and then I am saving this object, or I am storing this object in my object collection, that is the object table. Okay, similarly, I have created another object and then the third object, and all these objects are stored or collected in the object table. Then after this creation of the objects, I am looping the object table. Once we have got the object reference, so I'm calling the instance method get attribute using the object reference. So this will call the method get attribute. So if you look at the code of get attribute, basically we are just trying to display the data that is there for that particular instance. And we are also displaying the constant value as well. Next, after displaying or after looping at the object table and displaying all the object instances, I'm calling the display number of students using the class name. So here I will see the value 3 because the number of students, the global variable number of students value was incremented to 3. And here in this piece of code, I am showing you how do you call the functional method, that is by using the class name. Since it is a static functional method, so I'm using the class name with equal to greater than symbol and followed by the name of the functional method. So whatever returning parameter it gives me, that value I'm storing it in global variable seats vacant, and ultimately we are displaying this value seats vacant. Okay, and finally, if you look at the output of the program, this is the output of the program. So very first time, the attribute, static attribute, has the value 30 because that is the total seats in the class. Then when we haven't created any object, then the static attribute global variable number of students, it has value 0, which is good. Then we have created our first object. This is my second object. This is my third object. And the number of students in the CS department, obviously this is the value of global variable number of students, which is 3. And number of seats vacant, this I have got by calling the static method seats vacant. And this is basically the maximum number of students in the class minus the number of objects created, which gives me the value 27. So this is our example of working with instance method, static method, functional method, defining its parameter, calling the method, and even working with the attributes, that is instance attribute, static attribute, read-only attribute in object-oriented ABAP. So hope you would have liked this video. If you like this video, then please subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, then please subscribe and hit the bell icon.